Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Whodunit did not fall in polite droplets. It arrived as a horizontal grey curtain, driven by a wind that felt as though it had been sharpened on the ice floes of the Arctic. It was the kind of weather that made the residents of the Highland village retreat into their stone cottages, bolt the doors, and pray the peat held out. Inside the police station, a small drafty building that served as both office and home, PC Hamish Macbeth sat with his feet dangerously close to the humming electric fire. In his lap sat Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and questionable loyalty, who was currently snoring with a rhythmic intensity that Hamish found deeply enviable. Hamish was supposed to be filling out Community Outreach Initiative forms, a new directive from the higher-ups in Strathbane designed to prove that the police were proactive members of the social fabric. To Hamish, the social fabric of Whodunit was best maintained by staying out of it until someone stole a sheep or hit someone else with a shovel. "Do you hear that, Lugs?" Hamish murmured, stroking the dog's tattered ear. "They want me to identify potential nodes of seasonal friction. If that isn't a fancy talk for go find out who's annoyed at whom, I don't know what is." He stood up, his tall, lanky frame uncoiling like a slow-moving spring. His shock of red hair was, as usual, a disaster area, and his hazel eyes held a look of permanent, deceptive vacuity. To an outsider, Hamish Macbeth looked like a man who struggled to remember his own middle name. In reality, he was currently calculating if he could slip down to the river and rescue a salmon from the freezing waters without the water bailiff, or anyone else being the wiser. A Christmas salmon would be just the thing. Since Priscilla Halberton Smythe had gone off to London again for some high society gala, and Elspeth Grant was busy with a school play in Drim, Hamish was facing a holiday of canned beans and solitude. However, the seasonal friction arrived before he could reach for his fishing gear. The peace of the village had been recently disturbed by the arrival of Mr. Julian Vane Tempest. Julian was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, a retired hedge fund manager with a voice like a foghorn and a wardrobe consisting entirely of pristine, overpriced Highland costumes he had purchased the Larches, a sprawling Victorian pile on the edge of the loch. Julian didn't just want to live in Whodunit, he wanted to improve it. "Macbeth, are you in there, man, or are you hibernating like the rest of this wretched village?" The door to the station swung open, admitting a blast of freezing air and Julian Vane Tempest. He was dressed in a bright yellow oilskin that looked like it belonged on a North Sea trawler, though he had likely never been splashed by anything saltier than a margarita. "Good morning, Mr. Vane Tempest," Hamish said, his voice dropping into the slow, rhythmic lilt that made him sound half asleep. "And a grand morning it is if you happen to be a duck. It's a disgrace, Macbeth. The village hall is a draughty barn. The hotel serves coffee that tastes like boiled peat, and the locals are, well, they're locals. Taciturn, suspicious, and frankly lazy." Julian paced the small room, Lugs watching him with one suspicious eye. "I am hosting a grand Highland Christmas feast tonight. A proper black tie affair. I've flown in a chef from London. I expect the road to the Larches to be salted and cleared of any debris." "Debris?" Hamish asked mildly. "Sheep, Macbeth. Your constituents' woolly nuisances are everywhere. And I've heard rumours of poaching. I want you on patrol tonight. Keep the riffraff away from my gates." Hamish sighed, a sound of deep spiritual exhaustion. "Tonight is Christmas Eve, Mr. Vane Tempest. Most of the riffraff will be at the pub or in the kirk. They'll no be wanting to climb your hill in a gale to look at your London chef. I'm serious, Macbeth. I've invited the local gentry, though that's a loose term here, including the Halberton Smythes. If anything goes wrong, I'll have your badge. I have friends in the Home Office, you know." Hamish didn't doubt it. People like Julian always had friends in places that made life difficult for people like Hamish. "I shall keep an eye out," Hamish said, giving a small mock salute that Julian was too self-absorbed to recognise as an insult. After the Sassenachs stormed out, Hamish looked at Lugs. "A black tie feast in this weather. He's asking for trouble, Lugs. In the Highlands, when ye try to put on airs, the mountains usually find a way to knock them out of ye." He sat back down and reached for his tin of tobacco. The grand Highland Christmas feast sounded like a nightmare of cold champagne and warm resentment. He had no idea just how right he was, or that by tomorrow morning, Julian Vane Tempest would be providing the village with a far more permanent silence than any Highland gale could manage. The wind howled like a banshee through the chimney of the police station, a sound that Hamish usually found oddly comforting when he had a fire going and a full pot of tea. He had just finished preparing his illicitly acquired salmon, the flesh a perfect pale pink, when the first tremors of the storm began to shake the very foundations of the building. Lugs, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, crawled further under the kitchen table, leaving Hamish alone with his conscience and his dinner. He had hoped, with a fervour that bordered on the religious, that the grand Highland Christmas feast up at the Larches would proceed without any need for police intervention. He pictured Julian Vane Tempest holding forth on the virtues of investment banking while the local gentry nodded politely and planned their escapes. It was a pleasant image, mostly because it did not involve Hamish having to leave his warm kitchen to deal with Julian's overbearing ego. The phone's shrill ring cut. Through the sound of the gale like a rusted knife, Hamish stared at the black plastic receiver with a look of profound betrayal. For a moment, he considered letting it ring until the caller gave up, but the persistence of the sound suggested something more than a mere noise complaint. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire Highlands, he picked it up. A man's voice, high-pitched and vibrating with pure, unadulterated panic, erupted on the other end. It was the London chef Julian had bragged about, a man named Henderson, who sounded as though he were currently being hunted by a pack of wolves. Between gasps for air, he managed to convey that something terrible had happened in the garden, and that Mr. Vane Tempest was quite definitely not breathing. Hamish hung up, his appetite for the salmon vanishing instantly. "Come on, Lugs," he muttered, reaching for his heavy greatcoat and his peaked cap. "The Sassenach has gone and ruined Christmas for everyone." The dog offered a low whine of protest, but eventually crawled out from his hiding spot, shaking himself as if preparing for battle. Outside, the world was a chaos of white sleet and black shadows. The walk up to the Larches was a grueling climb against the wind, the path slick with a treacherous layer of freezing slush. By the time Hamish reached the massive wrought-iron gates, his ears were numb, and his temper was fraying at the edges. The house itself was ablaze with light, every window glowing with an artificial warmth that felt jarring against the savage, indifferent cold of the Highland night. He did not go to the front door. Following the sound of sobbing, he rounded the side of the Victorian mansion toward the Versailles garden Julian had so proudly described to anyone who would listen. There, under the harsh glare of several outdoor floodlights, was the scene of the crime. The guests, a huddle of shivering figures in tuxedos and evening gowns, were standing at a distance, their faces pale masks of horror. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was among them. Her elegant features tightened with a mix of shock and characteristic coolness. At the centre of the garden stood the fountain, a garish marble monstrosity depicting Neptune wrestling a sea monster. Julian Vane Tempest was there too, though Neptune was no longer the focal point of the display. The master of the house was face down in the shallow, partially frozen basin of the fountain. He was still wearing his flamboyant, brand-new kilt in the Vane Tempest family tartan, a pattern Hamish was certain had been invented in a London department store 6 months ago. His sporran floated listlessly beside him like a drowned animal, and his silver-buckled shoes were visible just above the surface of the slushy water. It was a bizarre and humiliating end for a man who had spent his life demanding the world's undivided attention. He looked less like a fallen titan of finance, and more like a discarded puppet thrown into the wash. The water around him was beginning to turn a dark, murky shade, though whether from blood or dirt Hamish could not yet tell in the flickering light. Hamish stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen grass. He felt the weight of the guest's eyes on him, expecting him to do something official, something heroic. Instead, he just stood there for a long moment, his hands deep in his pockets, observing the way Julian's head was wedged beneath the stone trident of Neptune. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, but something was inherently wrong. Hamish noticed a single bright blue silk ribbon snagged on the edge of the fountain, fluttering wildly in the wind. It was a festive decoration, surely, but it was not the same colour as the rest of the garden's trimmings. He also noted that Julian's heavy gold wristwatch was missing, though his expensive rings remained on his blue-tinged fingers. "He just fell," Henderson the chef sobbed, clutching a white dishcloth as if it were a rosary. "He went out to check the lights, and he did not come back. We thought he was just being difficult." Hamish nodded slowly, but his mind was already moving past the simple explanation of a drunken slip. Julian was a vain man, but he was also a careful one. He would not have risked his dignity in a fountain without some form of help. As the distant, mournful wail of a police siren began to rise from the direction of Strathbane, Hamish felt a familiar sinking sensation in his stomach. DCI Blair would be on that siren, ready to stomp through the evidence with all the grace of a frightened elephant. The peace of Whodunit was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating murder that smelled of more than just frozen water. The siren's wail finally crested the hill, its blue light strobing against the Victorian stone of the larches with a rhythmic, nauseating intensity. Hamish stood his ground by the fountain, his hands still deep in his greatcoat pockets, while Luggs sat at his heel, shivering and looking as though he'd much rather be anywhere else. 2 vehicles roared up the gravel drive, scattering slush and ice as they skidded to a halt. Out of the first car stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking like a man who had been woken from a very deep, very liquid sleep. His neck was thick, his jowls were a vibrant shade of bruised plum, and his eyes were perpetually narrowed as if he were trying to see through a thick fog of his own making. Behind him came Detective Jimmy Anderson and Detective Willie McLean, both looking equally miserable and significantly more damp. Blair didn't bother with greetings. He simply stomped toward the fountain, his heavy boots splashing into the basin's overflow without a single care for the preservation of the crime scene. "Macbeth, you great ginger streak of nothing," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the garden walls and causing several of the shivering guests to jump. "I might have known you'd be standing here like a garden gnome while a body goes cold. What the devil have you been doing? Admiring the scenery?" Hamish didn't flinch, though the spray from Blair's arrival had dampened his trousers even further. "I've been securing the perimeter, sir," Hamish said, his Highland lilt thickening to a degree that usually signalled he was being particularly obstructive, "and observing the witnesses. It's a sad business, surely." Blair let out a sound that was half snort and half growl, moving closer to the water to glare down at the remains of Julian Vane Tempest. "Observing? You wouldn't know a clue if it bit you on your lazy backside. Look at this. The man's drunk, he's slipped, and he's cracked his skull on the stone. It's an accident. A bloody Christmas nuisance meant to ruin my evening." Blair reached down and grabbed the floating sporran, shaking it out over the fountain as if expecting gold coins to fall out. When only freezing water emerged, he tossed it back with a curse. He completely ignored the fluttering blue silk ribbon that Hamish had noticed earlier, his heavy boot actually treading it into the slush. "Right then," Blair barked, turning his attention to the huddle of guests. He ignored the lower-ranked staff and marched straight toward Priscilla Halberton Smythe. His face underwent a grotesque transformation, shifting from raw aggression to a kind of greasy sycophantic grin. "Miss Halberton Smythe, so sorry you had to witness such a sordid little tumble. A tragedy, truly. Too much of the local hospitality, I imagine?" Priscilla looked at Blair with the same detached interest she might show a particularly ugly species of toad. "I doubt it was a tumble, Inspector. Julian was quite fastidious about his footing, and he was quite sober when he left the dining room." Blair's grin faltered, his face darkening again. He didn't like being corrected, especially not by someone he couldn't bully. He turned his gaze back to Henderson, the London chef, who was still clutching his dishcloth. "You, the cook, you said you saw him fall?" Henderson stammered, his eyes darting between Blair's red face and the body in the water. "No, sir, I said I found him. I heard a splash, or perhaps a thud, and when I came out he was like that." Blair stepped into the chef's personal space, looming over him. "A splash or a thud? Make up your mind, man. And where's his watch? A man like that doesn't go for a walk without a £5,000 timepiece. You've probably got it hidden in your flour bin, haven't you?" The chef turned a shade of white that matched his apron. I don't have any watch, sir. I was in the kitchen." "Likely story," Blair sneered, turning back to Hamish. "There you have it, Macbeth. A simple case of theft and accidental drowning. Or perhaps the cook here gave him a shove. Either way, it's a Strathbane matter now. I don't want your big, clumsy feet trampling over my investigation. You're dismissed. Go back to your station and try not to fall into any holes on the way. Anderson, McLean, get the body out of there and start tossing the kitchen. I want that watch found." Hamish watched as the detectives began their clumsy work, seeing them disturb the very evidence he had been trying to protect. He saw the way the blue ribbon was kicked aside once more, and he saw a small dark object beneath the fountain's lip that Blair had missed entirely, a small silver whistle. Hamish didn't point it out. Experience had taught him that trying to help Blair was like trying to teach a pig to whistle. It wasted your time and annoyed the pig. Instead, he let out a submissive, weary sigh. "As you wish, sir. I'll just be taking Lugs home then. It's a terrible night for a dog to be out." He turned away, his expression one of blank rural incompetence. As he walked back down the drive, past the line of expensive cars and the weeping chef, Hamish felt the prickle of a different kind of cold. It wasn't the sleet. It was the realization that Blair was looking for a watch, while the real killer was likely still standing in the garden, warming their hands in their pockets. Hamish knew he was officially off the case, which meant he was finally free to actually solve it. He needed tea, he needed a fire, and most importantly, he needed to start mooching for the truth. The morning after the storm brought a stillness to Whodunit that felt more like a held breath than a peaceful reprieve. The frost had transformed the grey stone cottages into glittering monuments, and the loch itself was as flat and dark as a sheet of obsidian. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in what he considered his most vital investigative technique, the slow, deliberate brewing of a very large pot of tea. He knew that while DCI Blair was likely currently shouting at a terrified Henderson in the back of a police van, the answers to why Julian Van Tempest had died lay in the village whispers. He dressed with his usual lack of care, pulling on a thick, woolly jumper that had seen better decades, and whistled for Lugs. The dog, sensing that today involved visits to places with potential biscuits, scrambled to his feet with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. Their first stop was the post office, the central nervous system of Whodunit gossip. Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, was currently engaged in a vigorous battle with a recalcitrant heater. She looked up as the bell jingled, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. "A fine mess you've let happen up at the big house, Hamish Macbeth," she started, not even waiting for a greeting. "A murder on Christmas Eve. It's scandalous. The tourists will think we're a pack of heathens." Hamish leaned against the counter, his expression one of mild bovine curiosity. "Aye, it's a dark business, Mrs. Kennedy. A terrible accident, the inspector from Strathbane says. A slip and a fall." Mrs. Kennedy let out a derisive snort. A slip? That man was too full of himself to slip. He walked as if he owned the gravity of the earth itself. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "He was a wicked man, Hamish. Did you know he was trying to buy the deeds to the old Kirk path? He wanted to put up a fence. A fence! To keep us out of the woods where our fathers walked." Hamish accepted a ginger nut biscuit, chewing it slowly as he absorbed this. A motive as old as the Highlands themselves, land. He had a lot of letters, didn't he? Hamish asked softly. Mrs. Kennedy nodded vigorously. Legal letters, threatening letters. And there was that woman, the one who stayed at the hotel last week. A cousin, he called her, but she had the look of a debt collector in expensive shoes. They had a row right here in this shop, shouting about missing investments and trust funds until I had to tell them to take their noise elsewhere. Hamish filed the cousin away in his mental cabinet. Julian had presented himself as a titan of wealth, but if he was being hounded by creditors, the image was as fake as his tartan. Leaving the post office, Hamish made his way to the Tommel Castle Hotel. The lobby was a hive of frantic activity as the staff tried to manage the fallout of the previous night's events. Hamish drifted toward the kitchen, knowing that the back door was always the best entry point for information. There he found Jessie, the head waitress, who was nursing a cup of coffee and looking utterly drained. "Hamish," she sighed, "don't you start. It's been a madhouse." Hamish sat down and looked at her with his soft, empathetic eyes. "I just heard the poor chef is in a bad way with the police, Jessie. Seems a shame if he's taking the blame for something he didn't do." Jessie slammed her cup down. "It's a disgrace. Henderson was in the kitchen all night. I saw him. But Mr. Van Tempest, he was a monster. He hadn't paid the extra staff from the village for 3 weeks. He told them they should be grateful for the experience of working at his table." She leaned in closer, the scent of stale coffee and resentment hanging between them. "And there was the business with the silver. He accused old Angus of stealing a spoon, when everyone knows Julian probably misplaced it in his own clutter. He looked for any excuse to fire people. He was a mean, hollow man, Hamish. There's not a soul in this village who'll shed a tear, except maybe for the lost wages. Hamish nodded, his mind drifting back to the silver whistle he'd seen in the fountain. It hadn't been a spoon. It was a whistle, the kind used for training gun dogs. Julian didn't have a dog. He hated animals. So why was a whistle in his fountain? He needed to find Priscilla. She understood the intricacies of social climbing and all the vanity that defined Julian's life. She would know if he had been hiding secrets behind his false tartan and his arrogant, booming voice. The walk up the winding drive of Tommel Castle was a study in Highland contrasts, the rugged, unforgiving beauty of the frost-shattered pines against the manicured, arrogant perfection of the Halberton Smythe estate. Hamish Macbeth trudged along, his hands tucked into his sleeves, while Lugs made a point of stopping to sniff every aristocratic gatepost they passed. Hamish was heading for the morning room, a place he knew Priscilla Halberton Smythe would be occupying at this hour, likely drinking Earl Grey and wondering why she had ever returned to Lochdu for the holidays. He felt the familiar, dull ache of his long-standing affection for her, a feeling that was usually met with the kind of polite, distant friendship one might afford a favourite, slightly eccentric gardener. He found her exactly as expected, framed by a massive window that looked out over the loch. Priscilla was dressed in a cashmere sweater the colour of a winter sky, looking entirely untroubled by the fact that she had witnessed a corpse in a fountain only hours before. "Hamish," she said, her voice cool and melodic. "I suspected you'd be avoiding the main road. Inspector Blair has been roaring up and down it in a police car, looking like he's about to have a stroke." Hamish sank into a delicate velvet chair that creaked under his weight, Lugs flopping down onto the Persian rug with a sigh of canine entitlement. He's a man of many passions, Priscilla, and currently his passion is finding a gold watch that isn't there. He's convinced the cook is a mastermind of international jewel theft. Priscilla smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Julian didn't have a gold watch, Hamish, at least not one he owned. He'd been leasing his entire life, the cars, the house, even the clothes. My father looked into his credentials when he first arrived. Julian Vane Tempest was a shell, a man built entirely of credit and audacious lies. He came here to hide from people he'd swindled in the city, thinking the Highlands were too remote for the law, or the lawless, to find him. Hamish leaned forward, his interest piqued. Mrs. Kennedy mentioned a cousin who visited, a woman with an edge to her. Priscilla nodded, setting her teacup down with a sharp, precise click. "That would be Mrs. Arbuthnot. She isn't a cousin, she's a creditor. Her late husband was one of the men Julian ruined. She's been following him for months, demanding what's left of her inheritance. She was at the feast last night, though she spent most of the evening in the library, looking as though she wanted to set the curtains on fire." Hamish rubbed his chin, the stubble rasping in the quiet room. "And what of the whistle, Priscilla? A silver gun-dog whistle. It was in the fountain basin, tucked under the lip of the stone." Priscilla's brow furrowed slightly, a rare sign of genuine concentration. A whistle? Julian loathed dogs. He called them vectors for mud. But I do remember seeing a whistle like that recently. It belongs to Colonel Hallathorne. He's the one Julian was trying to buy the Kirk Path from. The Colonel is a man of the old school, Hamish. He believes in two things: the sanctity of Scottish soil and the discipline of a well-trained Labrador. He and Julian had a public row at the pub last week. Julian threatened to sue him into the poorhouse if he didn't sell the land. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, though they still didn't form a picture he liked. So we have a vengeful creditor and a Highland colonel with a temper and a silver whistle. And both were at the house last night. Priscilla looked at him intently. "You think the colonel did it? He's a proud man, Hamish, but he's not a murderer." Hamish stood up, whistling softly for Lugs. "In my experience, Priscilla, pride is often the shortest bridge to a very dark place. Julian wasn't just taking the colonel's land, he was insulting his dignity. In Lochdu, you can steal a man's sheep, and he might forgive you, but you insult his honour, and you've made a very patient enemy." As he prepared to leave, Priscilla caught his arm, her hand light but firm. "Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in his way, he'll happily make it you. He's already telling everyone that you missed the obvious signs of a struggle." Hamish gave her a slow, deceptive wink. "Let him talk, Priscilla. While the DCI is busy looking for signs of a struggle, I'll be looking for the person who didn't have to struggle at all. A man who knows how to command, and a man who knows how to make a noisy Sassenach go quiet, usually knows exactly where to stand in the dark. He stepped back out into the freezing air, the luxury of the morning room replaced by the sharp, honest bite of the wind. He had a name now, and he had a silver whistle. He also had a very strong feeling that Colonel Hallathorne was about to become DCI Blair's favourite new suspect, which was exactly what Hamish needed to prevent. The walk back down from Tommel Castle was interrupted by the sudden, violent roar of a Land Rover engine. It was Blair, of course, driving as though he were, participating in a rally through the Highlands, rather than navigating a narrow, icy road. He screeched to a halt beside Hamish, sending a spray of slush over the policeman's boots. Blair leaned out of the window, his face a triumphant shade of magenta. "Out of the way, Macbeth. I've got him. I've got the old fossil, land dispute, motive, and a silver whistle found at the scene. It's a slam dunk." Hamish watched the vehicle disappear around the bend toward the Colonel's cottage, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. It was all too neat, too perfect, the kind of evidence that arrives with a bow on it. He began to walk faster, his long legs eating up the distance, lugs trotting gamely beside him as the wind began to pick up once more, whistling through the skeletal larch trees. By the time Hamish arrived at the Colonel's small, impeccably kept stone cottage, the scene was one of utter chaos. Blair and his two subordinates were in the process of hauling Colonel Hallathorne toward the police car. The Colonel, a man who looked as though he had been carved out of Highland granite, was putting up a spirited resistance, his face a matching shade to Blair's. "Release me, you overblown peacock!" the Colonel roared, his voice carrying across the valley. "I was nowhere near that man's garish fountain last night. I was tending to my own affairs," Blair sneered, holding up a clear plastic evidence bag containing a silver whistle. "Then explain this, you old fraud. Found it right where you pushed him, and we found the matching leather cord in your hallway. You had the motive, he was stealing your land, and you had the opportunity." Hamish stood by the gate, watching the struggle with a deceptive look of vacancy. He noticed the Colonel's two yellow Labradors, usually the most boisterous animals in the parish, sitting perfectly still by the kennel, their ears flattened. They weren't barking. They were confused. "Excuse me, sir," Hamish said softly, his voice barely rising above the wind. Blair spun around, his eyes bulging. "I thought I told you to get lost, Macbeth. Can't you see I'm busy making an arrest?" Hamish stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the silver whistle in the bag. "It's just that the Colonel's whistle is a very specific thing, sir. It's an antique Acme handed down from his father. It has a distinctive dent on the mouthpiece from where the Colonel bit it during a particularly difficult grouse shoot in 1964. Blair looked at the whistle in the bag. It was pristine, shiny, and clearly modern. "So he bought a new one to commit the murder. People do that, Macbeth. It's called premeditation. Now get out of my way before I arrest you for obstruction." The Colonel stopped struggling for a moment, looking at Hamish with a mixture of surprise and begrudging respect. "I didn't buy a new whistle," the Colonel spat. "I haven't bought a new piece of kit since the decimalisation of the currency." Hamish nodded slowly, moving toward the front door of the cottage, where the leather thong was draped over a peg. "The thong is real enough," Hamish murmured, "but the whistle in the fountain is a silent model. It's for training dogs at a distance using high-frequency sound." He turned back to Blair, his expression one of mild, helpful confusion. "The Colonel is 78 years old, sir. He's as deaf as a post in his left ear from his time in the artillery. He can't hear a silent whistle. Why would a man who can't hear the signal use it to lure a victim? More importantly, if the Colonel had gone to the Larches last night, those two dogs would have followed him. They're never more than a yard from his heels. Yet, when the chef found the body, there were no dog tracks in the slush, just a single set of human prints and that blue silk ribbon." Blair's face shifted from triumph to a dangerous simmering rage. "Tracks get washed away. The ribbon is a decoration, and maybe he left the dogs behind to be stealthy. The Colonel doesn't." "Do stealthy, sir," Hamish replied, his voice gaining a slight edge of firmness. "He does frontal assault. And there's the matter of the Kirk. Yesterday evening, between the hours of 8 and 10, exactly when Mr. Vane Tempest was meeting his end, the Colonel was in the church basement. The pipes had frozen, and he was the only one with the tools to fix them. The minister saw him there. He was covered in rust and freezing water, not fountain slush. Blair let out a frustrated growl, realizing his slam dunk was evaporating in the face of local logic. He shoved the colonel away, nearly knocking the old man over. Fine. If it wasn't the fossil, then I'll find who it was. But you, Macbeth, if you're so smart, why haven't you found the watch? Because that's the real motive. Theft. As Blair stomped back to his car, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows, Hamish looked at the colonel. The old soldier straightened his tweed jacket, his eyes lingering on the silver whistle still in Blair's possession. He's a fool, Macbeth, the colonel muttered. But you're a nuisance. Hamish gave a small, weary smile. Aye, Colonel, being a nuisance is the only thing that keeps the peace in this village. He watched the police car scream away, knowing that the red herring had served its purpose. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame the colonel, using a whistle he couldn't use and a ribbon he didn't own. The killer wasn't an outsider looking for a land deal. The killer was someone who knew the village's grievances well enough to weaponize them. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing against Hamish's chest as he marched toward the centre of Whodunit. Lugs, sensing the seriousness of his master's stride, didn't stop to investigate the usual scents along the stone walls. Hamish's mind was a whir of disjointed images, the silver whistle, the blue ribbon, and Julian Van Tempest's face-down dignity in a freezing fountain. He didn't believe in coincidences. He needed a vantage point, and in Whodunit, that meant a place with a clear view and a warm stove. He steered himself toward the Empire Curry House run by Mr. Patel, a man whose observations were sharp. Inside, the air was thick with cumin and turmeric. Mr. Patel was polishing the counter with a cloth that had seen better days. He looked up. The law arrives, Patel remarked, sliding a glass of chai toward Hamish, and the law looks as though it has been chewed by a Highland cow and spat out again. Hamish took a long, grateful swallow of the tea, the heat radiating through his shivering limbs. It's been a long night, Patel, and a longer morning. Tell me, did Julian Vane Tempest ever frequent your establishment? Patel's expression soured instantly. He came once. He complained that the spices were inauthentic and tried to pay with a credit card that was as thin as a poppadom. He was a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice far more than the taste of my food. Hamish's eyes drifted to a small framed photograph on the wall behind the counter. It was a picture of a local man, Angus the Gilly, standing proudly beside a magnificent black-faced ewe. Fixed to the top of the frame was a blue silk ribbon, identical to the one Hamish had seen fluttering in the fountain's slush. That's a fine animal, Hamish said, his voice dropping into its slow, deceptive drawl. Patel sighed, a heavy sound that seemed to vibrate in the small room. It was a fine animal. That was Queen of the Glen. She won the Highland Prize 3 years running. She was Angus's whole world, Hamish, his legacy, his pride. And then 2 weeks ago, that Sassenach Vane Tempest came roaring down the back road in his oversized silver car. He hit her. He didn't even stop to see if she could be saved. He just laughed and said the sheep shouldn't have been jaywalking in their own hills. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with a sickeningly logical thud. In Whodunit, land was important and money was a necessity, but pride was sacred. To Julian, the sheep was a nuisance, a minor dent in a leased car. To Angus, it was a deliberate, mocking destruction of his life's achievement. Angus was at the feast last night, wasn't he? Hamish asked, though he already knew the answer. He was hired to help with the firewood and the heavy lifting, Patel replied, his voice barely a whisper. But he didn't stay. He said he couldn't stand the smell of Julian's perfume. He's a quiet man, Hamish. He doesn't say much, but he hears everything. He heard Julian's mockery and his schemes to exploit the village. Hamish stood up, the warmth of the chai now replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The murder hadn't been about a gold watch or a missing trust fund. It had been about the Queen of the Glen. The silver whistle hadn't been a training tool, it had been a signal, a way to lure Julian out into the garden where the wind would drown out his cries. The blue ribbon wasn't a decoration, it was a calling card, a small piece of justice left behind by a man who had lost his reason for being. Angus, the invisible Gilly, the man who knew every inch of the land and every shadow of the night, had waited. He had watched Julian stumble out, perhaps to investigate the sound of the silent whistle only Julian's hearing aids could catch. He realized then that the watch was a total fabrication. Yes, it was a motive so petty and human that a man like Blair would never see it. Blair was looking for greed, for the grand gestures of professional criminals. He would never understand the silent rage of a man whose heart had been broken by the death of a sheep and the laughter of a fool. Hamish felt a pang of genuine sorrow. He liked Angus. He understood the bond between a man and his work. But murder was murder, even in the name of a prize-winning ewe. He needed to find Angus before Blair's frustration turned back toward the village with renewed blind violence. He had to set a trap, not for a killer, but for the truth. The sleet had transitioned into a fine, stinging mist as Hamish Macbeth stepped out of the Empire Curry House. He felt the cold weight of the silver whistle in his memory, the one Blair had seized, and the image of the blue ribbon fluttering in the fountain's slush. He knew Angus the Gilly was a man of the hills, governed by a code far older and more rigid than any Strathbane regulation. If Angus had killed Julian, he wouldn't have done it for money or land. He would have done it for justice, Highland style, for the Queen of the Glen. Yet, Hamish could not let a murder stand, even if the victim was a man whose absence improved the local atmosphere. He made his way to the Lochdu Arms. The pub was the village's unofficial parliament, a place where secrets were traded for pints of heavy in the smoke of illicit tobacco. As he entered, the chatter died down for a fraction of a second, a sure sign that he was the primary topic of conversation. He walked to the bar, Lugs following with a wag of his tail. "A pint of the usual, Archie," Hamish said to the barman, "and perhaps a small bowl of water for the beast." Archie slid the glass over, leaning in. "Blair's been through here like a whirlwind, Hamish. Says he's got the Colonel. Is it true?" Hamish took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to draw the attention of every ear in the room. Angus was sitting in the furthest corner, his weathered face shadowed by his bonnet, nursing a single malt. "The Colonel is back in his cottage," Hamish said loudly. The inspector had the wrong end of the stick. "But it doesn't matter now. They finally found the black box." A ripple of confusion went through the pub. "The what?" Archie asked. "The watch," Hamish lied smoothly, his face a mask of rural simplicity. "It turns out Julian Vane Tempest wasn't just a vain man, he was a paranoid one. That gold watch Blair was looking for? It wasn't just a timepiece. It had a built-in GPS and a voice-activated recorder. The London office says the data is being uploaded to a server in Edinburgh as we speak. It recorded everything. The sounds of the garden, the footsteps, even the last words spoken before he went into the water." He caught the briefest tightening of Angus's jaw. The old Gilly didn't look up, but his hand gripped his glass with a sudden, white-knuckled intensity. "They say the signal is strongest near the old sheep pens by the Kirk Path," Hamish continued, leaning confidently across the bar. "Blair thinks the killer threw it there to hide the evidence. He's sending a forensic team from Glasgow tomorrow morning with a metal detector and a signal tracker. They'll find it, sure as the tide comes in. And once they have the recording, well, it's all over but the shouting. A recording?" A voice piped up from the corner. It was a local crofter. "You mean it heard the killer?" "Every word," Hamish said, finishing his pint. "And every splash. It's a marvel of modern science, isn't it? A bit beyond a simple man like me. But the inspector is delighted. He says he'll have the handcuffs on the real culprit by lunchtime tomorrow." He paid for his drink and signalled to Lugs. As he walked toward the door, he didn't look at Angus. He didn't need to. He knew that for a man who prided himself on his silence and his craft, the idea of a talking watch would be an unbearable, supernatural threat. Angus would know that he hadn't seen a watch on Julian's wrist when he pushed him, but he couldn't be sure if it had been tucked in a pocket or hidden under a sleeve. The doubt would fester like a splinter in the mind. Outside, the night had turned bitterly cold again. The stars were out, sharp and indifferent over the dark peaks of the Quillins. Hamish didn't go back to the station. Instead, he circled around the back of the village, moving with the quiet grace of a poacher. He headed for the Kirk Path, the very land Julian had tried to steal from the village. He found a spot in the shadow of an old dry stone wall where the wind was broken by a stand of gorse. He settled in to wait. He knew the trap was clumsy, a Sassenach trick for a Highland problem, but it was the only way to draw Angus out without involving Blair's heavy-handed tactics. If Angus came to search for the watch, it would be a confession of sorts. Hamish hoped the old man wouldn't come. He truly hoped he was wrong. But as the hours crawled by and the frost began to silver his greatcoat, he heard the faint rhythmic crunch of boots on the frozen path. Someone was coming, and they were, carrying a heavy rusted spade and lantern. The shadow moved with a heavy rhythmic gait that Hamish Macbeth knew, as well as his own reflection in the peat-stained waters of the Endure. It was the walk of a man accustomed to traversing miles of uneven heather and treacherous bog, a man who didn't fight the land but moved within its secret ancient folds. The lantern was kept low, its shuttered light casting a sickly flickering amber glow onto the frost-rimed grass of the kirk path. The figure stopped near a dense clump of gorse, where the earth was softest, setting the lantern down with a muffled clink that seemed to vibrate through the freezing soil. The first strike of the spade into the frozen turf sounded like a gunshot in the absolute silence of the Highland night. Hamish waited, his breath hitching in his throat, until the man had turned over 3 or 4 heavy, ragged clods of peat, before he decided to break the spell. He didn't stand up. He simply let his voice carry through the darkness like a ghost of a heavy thought. "It's a bit late for gardening, Angus, even for a man as industrious as yourself," Hamish said, his voice mild and conversational, though it carried an undercurrent of genuine sorrow. The spade stopped mid-swing. The figure froze instantly, the lantern light catching the cold glint of the steel blade. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the wind sighing through the pines and the distant rhythmic lap of the lock against the stones. Then, slowly, Angus straightened his back and turned his head toward the deep shadow where Hamish sat. He didn't look surprised, he looked weary, like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long and very steep mountain road, and found the path blocked by an old friend. "There is no watch, is there, Hamish?" Angus asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to come from the earth itself. He drove the spade into the ground and leaned on it, his shoulders slumped under the heavy weight of his old, patched tweed jacket. Hamish stood up, his joints protesting the biting cold, and walked slowly toward the small, guttering circle of light. "No, Angus. There is no talking watch, and certainly no GPS. Julian Vane Tempest wouldn't have spent money on a piece of technology that could hold him accountable for his own actions. He was a man built of cheap illusions and expensive lies. But you knew that better than most, didn't you?" Hamish stopped a few feet away, Lug standing alertly at his side, but without the usual growl. The dog knew Angus. He had accepted scraps of dried venison from the gillie's hand for years. It was the Queen of the Glen, wasn't it? Hamish continued softly, his eyes searching the old man's face. "You didn't kill him for the land, and you certainly didn't do it because the Colonel asked you to. You killed him because he laughed. He killed your pride and joy with his silver car, and then he laughed about it, as if it were nothing more than a bit of mud on his expensive shoe." Angus stared at the hole he had dug, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his bonnet. He didn't even look back, Hamish. She was lying there, her back broken, and he just sped on to the hotel for his feast. When I confronted him, he offered me £20 and told me to buy a better fence. A better fence! She was the finest ewe in the north, and he treated her like a nuisance. "So use the whistle," Hamish said, nodding toward the spade. "You knew he had those fancy digital hearing aids. You'd heard him bragging about how they could pick up frequencies no normal ear could touch. You stood by the fountain and blew that silent whistle. To him, it must have sounded like a high-pitched, agonizing scream in the dark. He came running out to see what the noise was, perhaps thinking his precious property was being invaded. And in the dark, on that slick marble, it didn't take much, did it?" Angus's face twisted, and he lunged with the spade. Hamish, despite his lanky frame, moved with a sudden, fluid speed that surprised the old gillie. He caught Angus's wrist, twisting the tool away, and pinned him against the wall. The struggle was brief but fierce, the spade clattering away. "Don't, Angus," Hamish panted. "It's over." The old man collapsed, his fight finally gone. "And the ribbon?" Hamish asked. "That was a mistake, Angus, a bit of sentiment that gave you away." Angus gave a short, bitter laugh. "It wasn't a mistake. I wanted him to go into the ground knowing." The walk back to the village was a sombre affair. Angus marched with the dignity of a man who had accepted his fate, the heavy spade resting across his shoulder like a soldier's rifle. The silence between the two men was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of a shared understanding of a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. Hamish felt the cold seep into his bones, not just from the wind, but from the tragedy of it all. They reached the station, but Hamish diverted them toward the Tommel Castle Hotel. He knew Blair would be there, likely nursing a final scotch and a bruised ego. "Listen, Angus," Hamish whispered as they neared the brightly lit entrance. "If you tell them you were looking for that watch I mentioned, the one with the recorder, Blair will think he's the one who scared you into a confession. He'll take the credit, and you'll get a fair hearing in Strathbane instead of being bullied here." Angus gave a slow, sombre nod. He didn't care about the credit, he only cared that the Queen of the Glen was finally avenged. They found Blair in the hotel lounge, his tie undone and his face a map of frustration. He looked up as Hamish entered, flanked by a dirt-streaked Angus. "Macbeth, what the devil are you doing here? I thought I told you to stay out of my sight." Hamish adopted his most vacant, apologetic expression. "Terribly sorry, sir. Truly I am. It's just, well, I was out walking lugs, following up on that brilliant theory of yours about the missing watch and the electronic trail. You mentioned earlier. You remember, sir? You said the killer would likely return to the scene if they thought their secrets were being recorded." Blair blinked, his small eyes darting between Hamish and the silent Gilly. He didn't remember saying any such thing, but the idea that he had conceived a brilliant theory was far too tempting to refute. "Of course I remember, Macbeth. I don't pay you to state the obvious. What of it?" "Well, sir," Hamish said, lowering his voice as if sharing a state secret, "your intuition was spot on. I found Angus here digging by the Kirk path, exactly where you suggested the signal would be strongest. He was looking for the watch, sir. He's confessed to everything, the whistle, the fountain, the whole business. He said your presence in the village made him lose his nerve." Blair stood up, his chest swelling with a sudden unearned pride. He smoothed his jacket, the magenta of his face shifting to a triumphant red. "Did he now? Well, well. I knew I'd break him. It's all about psychological pressure, Macbeth, something you wouldn't understand. Anderson! MacLean!" he roared toward the hallway. "Get the cuffs. I've cracked the case." As the other detectives arrived, looking bewildered but following Blair's lead, Hamish stepped back into the shadows. He watched as they led Angus away. Not roughly, for even Blair was too pleased with himself to be unnecessarily cruel in this moment of glory. Blair paused at the door, looking back at Hamish with a condescending sneer. "You see, Macbeth? This is how real police work is done. You were busy looking at ribbons and whistles, but I was looking at the man. I expect a full report on my desk by morning, detailing how my instructions led to this arrest. And don't try to take any of the glory. I'll be recommending myself for a commendation for this." "Wouldn't dream of it, sir," Hamish said, his voice a model of rural humility. "I'm glad it's finally over." "Sir, I'm far too slow for the city, as you always say. I'd only ever get in the way of a man of your calibre." Blair snorted, satisfied, and marched out into the night to begin his victory lap. Hamish stood in the quiet lounge for a moment, the silence of the Highlands reclaiming the room. A deep sense of relief washed over him. The case was solved, the village was safe, and importantly, he was PC Hamish Macbeth of Whodunit. He wouldn't be transferred to a concrete office in Glasgow. He wouldn't be forced to wear a suit every day or navigate the politics of headquarters. He had traded a bit of justice for his peace, and in the dark, cold reality of the North, that was often the bargain worth making. He whistled loudly for Lugs, who was waiting patiently by the door. "Come on, Lugs. Let's go home. I think there is still a bit of that salmon left, and the fire will be needing another log tonight." They stepped out into the night, the many indifferent stars watching over them, as Whodunit prepared to return to its quiet, deceptive sleep. The morning light that broke over Whodunit was of a clarity so sharp it seemed to pierce the very stone of the cottages. The grey curtain of the storm had been pulled back to reveal a sky of pale, biting blue, and the mountains stood draped in a fresh virginal layer of snow that sparkled with a deceptive innocence. The village felt scrubbed, clean, though the air remained heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. At the police station, the stove was humming a contented tune, and the aroma of frying salmon, the very fish Hamish had rescued from the river before the chaos began, filled the small kitchen with a scent of victory. Lugs sat by the table, his tail thumping a steady, expectant rhythm against the linoleum. He knew the difference between a working morning and a lazy morning, and this, thankfully, was the latter. The sound of a car engine, loud and arrogant even in retreat, echoed through the street. Hamish stepped to the window, fork in hand, to watch DCI Blair's car roar past the station toward the main road to Strathbane. Blair was leaning out of the window, shouting instructions into a radio. his face still glowing with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed he had outwitted both the criminal underworld and the Highlands themselves. He didn't look back at the small police station or the tall, red-headed man watching from the window. To Blair, Hamish was already a fading memory of rural incompetence, a footnote in the grand report that would surely earn the DCI a shiny new medal, or, at the very least, a mention in the Edinburgh papers. Hamish turned back to his pan, a slow, wry smile spreading across his face. The report was already written and filed, Blair's version, of course. It spoke of brilliant deductions, high-tech forensic possibilities, and the relentless pressure of a superior mind breaking a simple Highland gilly. There was no mention of a silver whistle, a blue silk ribbon, or a prize-winning ewe. There was certainly no mention of the fact that the electronic watch had been a complete fabrication of a local policeman's imagination. Angus would go to trial, but with the Colonel's high-priced lawyer, provided as a silent thank you for clearing his name, and the village's collective testimony about Julian's reckless driving, the sentence would likely be light. Manslaughter, perhaps, a moment of madness brought on by extreme provocation. In the Highlands, people understood that sometimes a man's heart could be broken by the death of a sheep and the laughter of a fool. A light knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Priscilla Halberton Smythe stood on the step, looking remarkably refreshed in a thick Aran sweater and tailored trousers. She didn't wait for an invitation. Stepping into the kitchen and sniffing the air. "I see the law has returned to its natural state of poaching and frying," she remarked, her eyes twinkling with that distant, amused affection. That always kept Hamish at arm's length. "I heard the news at the hotel. Blair is claiming he's the new Sherlock of the North. He's already told the local press that you were helpful with the luggage." Hamish plated the salmon, offering a piece to Luggs before sitting down. "He's a grand man, the inspector, truly a light unto the force. It would be a crime to hide such talent in a place like Whodunit, Priscilla. He belongs in the big city, where people appreciate a man who can shout louder than the wind." Priscilla sat across from him, leaning her chin on her hand. "You let him take it all, didn't you? The credit, the glory, the promotion. You're a very cunning man, Hamish Macbeth. Most people would want the world to know they were right. You just want the world to leave you alone. Being right is a very expensive hobby," Hamish replied, his voice a soft Highland burr. "If I were right in the way headquarters likes, they'd have me behind a desk in Glasgow before the week was out. I'd be wearing a tie that chokes me and breathing air that tastes like bus exhaust. Here, I have my dog, my stove, and a lock that tells me different stories every morning. Why would I trade that for a pat on the back from a man who can't tell a salmon from a sea trout?" They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable, unspoken understanding between them providing a warmth that the electric fire could never match. Priscilla eventually rose to leave, pausing at the door. "The village is talking, you know. They know it was you. They won't say it to Blair, and they won't say it to the papers, but they know. You've got a lot of seasonal friction to deal with now, Hamish. Half the parish will be dropping off pies and whiskey as thank-you gifts for keeping the Colonel out of jail." Hamish sighed, a sound of deep mock suffering. "It's a hard life, Priscilla. A man can barely get any peace for all the gratitude. I'll just have to lock the door and pretend I'm out on a very long patrol." As the door closed and her footsteps faded, Hamish settled back into his chair. The grand Highland Christmas feast was over, the Sassenach was gone, and the secret of the silver whistle was buried under the peat. He picked up his book, Luggs rested his head on his boot, and the quiet of Whodunit settled over the station like a well-worn blanket. He was exactly where he wanted to be, unnoticed, unpromoted, and perfectly, deceptively lazy.